Welcome to the Tough Decisions Network. This is our special Sunday edition called Survive and Thrive with Dennae. Your host, Dennae Handford, will dive deep into chapter-by-chapter discussions on specifically selected books to help you make better decisions as an entrepreneur. Visit toughdecisions.net to sign up for our free weekly entrepreneur email. Before we get started, let's hear from one of our sponsors. Have you ever thought about investing in real estate, but find yourself so busy that you don't have time for it? Do you have FOMO, which is the fear of missing out? At HandfordCapital.com, we help investors with passive real estate investments that project better returns than traditional investment vehicles such as the stock market. If you'd like to find out more about our passive real estate investments, visit HandfordCapital.com. That's HANDFORD capital.com. We will jump on a call with you to discuss your investment goals and to see if our investments are a good fit for you. This advertisement is not to be construed as an offer or recommendation to buy or sell a security. Visit HandfordCapital.com.
Hello, and welcome to the Tough Decisions podcast. This is your Sunday edition, and I'm your host, Dennae. If you have been following us for the last several weeks, then you know that Sundays is our day where we take topics from a book and just discuss them briefly, apply them as we can to our business and personal life. And so the book that we've been talking through the last several weeks is Talk Like TED, The 9 Public Speaking Secrets of the World's Top Minds, written by Carmine Gallo. Now, we're going to move in today to the last section of the book, the last 3 public speaking secrets. But I want to just kind of tie things together from the last 5 or 6 weeks and just ask you to remember that Gallo has listened to hundreds, maybe thousands of hours of TED Talks, and what he's done is pull those apart and come up with what he believes are 9 secrets or nine techniques for public speaking that make an effective speaker. And so what he's done then is put them into this book, and he's divided them into 3 different categories. So he says if you're giving a public speech or a public presentation, you need to first of all make that presentation emotional. And we talked about the actual 3 secrets there, displaying a passion and having a conversation and using gestures to connect to your audience. He secondly talks about making the presentation novel and presenting new material in new ways and appealing to human brain's attraction to something new. So those are the first 2, emotional, make the presentation novel. The last one, the last category is Gallo says that the presentation should be memorable. And so he's going to spend the last 3 chapters then talking about how to make the presentation memorable. And I'm going to combine the last 2 chapters. So next week we'll wrap up this study of these topics here in this book. But today I want to take some time to talk with you about it's secret number 7 is how it works out to be. So we're talking about making the presentation memorable. We're on secret number 7. And the title of this chapter is Stick to the 18-Minute Rule. Now, as it sounds, basically he's referring to the TED rule that all presentations must be less than 18 minutes. If you give a TED Talk, it has to fall under 18 minutes. So why 18 minutes? What's magical about 18 minutes? Well, there's nothing magical about that specific number, 18 minutes, although Gallo does say that he feels like the Goldilocks point of public speaking is somewhere between 18 and 20 minutes, and I'll come back to that, basically saying that that's the just right amount. A little less than that can create problems, a little more than that can create problems. The just right point, or the Goldilocks point for a presentation is somewhere between 18 and 20 minutes. But why is that? Well, thinking is hard work. And if you're going to engage your audience, then you're going to require them to think. And honestly, if your presentation doesn't require them to think, then really, what are you doing anyway? You're not going to be very effective if you haven't engaged them to the point where they're actually using their brain and thinking. And there's a concept that Gallo explains. It's called cognitive backlog. I'll give you just a second to think about that. A concept called cognitive backlog, which basically states that as we are listening or taking in, so it could also be reading, but as we're listening or reading or being exposed to new information, the brain is sort of building up and holding that new information in a short-term memory fashion. So it hasn't become a permanent part of your knowledge yet. And so the brain hasn't filed it away, if you will. It hasn't organized it in a nice, neat manner so that it can be recalled. It's sort of just holding it there. And the more that it has to hold there in limbo, if you will, then the greater that you have to work, the greater the energy that is used to do that, but also a concept of anxiety or mental anxiety that develops because we don't know what to do with that information, right? The brain needs time. It actually needs downtime in order to organize and assimilate and file all that information in a usable way. But if you or any other speaker gets up and just spouts new information for hours, even 50 minutes or 1 hour, the brain reaches this point where it really can't hold any more new information. It needs a break. So 18 minutes, or right around that point, according to research, is a place where the brain can take in new information and can comfortably hold that information for that amount of time before it has a break. Now, let me just throw this in there right now so we can get this out of the way. What if you're a speaker and you've been allotted 2 hours to speak? So what do? Well, the solution is you give breaks, right? You break things up. You don't, give new information, fact after fact after fact for 50 minutes or an hour and a half or 120 minutes, whatever it is you have. You break it up. You give some facts, you give some new concepts, and then you tell a story. Or, you have someone else, you have a video clip that you can play, and you break things up that way. So there is a way to adhere to that 18-minute rule if you've been allotted 50 minutes or an hour and a half or something longer even to speak. We'll get that out of the way, and then we can continue now. How do we stick to the 18 minutes, and why is that important? Well, a lot of times we have this concept that anxiety only affects the speaker, right? If you have to speak in public, then, getting a little bit nervous and getting a little bit anxious can be a pretty commonplace thing. But research has shown that actually the anxiety can also affect the listener, because as I mentioned, anyone who's wanting to learn and is anticipating a good presentation is going to be fully mentally engaged, and they're going to want to hold that information there until they know what to do with it. And so thinking and listening can be a very physically demanding activity. And the brain wants to hold this information, and if you keep piling and piling and piling and piling and piling, eventually it's just going to drop all of it. And so we need breaks. We need time to process. We need to be given new information in small chunks so that we can have the time to file that away and put it away in a way that we can recall it and use it again. Obviously, the longer the presentation is, then the more the brain has to organize, comprehend, remember, and there's only so long that can happen before, like I said, we just drop it, meaning we start to forget things, and also that the anxiety reaches the point where it's like, okay, I just give up. I can't remember all of this. Well, I think a simple illustration will show us exactly how demanding it is on our bodies physically to try to learn and be engaged mentally for a very long period of time. When I was getting ready to have our first child, one of the things that I did was do some reading on, scheduling for babies and how to, work their schedule around the lives of the parents and what kind of sleep they need and so on and so forth. And one of the things that I read and has made a big impact on the way that I parent is that sleep is so important for children. Babies, children, all the way up through, young adulthood, really. But specifically, I was at that point thinking about babies. And what they have found is that there is a correlation between the amount of sleep that babies get and their intelligence later in life. And how they explain that is that when a baby is first born, everything is new. And I don't know that we can even really comprehend exactly how much transition and adaptation goes on in those first days and weeks and months of life. But I mean, just think about how quickly and how dramatically their environment changes in just a matter of minutes. And those first days and weeks, they are just, adapting and getting used to living outside the womb. The environment is so different from everything that they've grown accustomed to for 9 months or more. And what they have found is that a baby, will be awake for a few minutes. If you're lucky, they might be awake for an hour, and then they go right back to sleep for 2, 3, sometimes 4 hours. And if you're a parent, you might be going, how does this child sleep for 4 hours? They were awake for like 10 minutes and all they did was eat while they were awake. How come they're sleeping now? Well, the answer lies in the fact that that downtime and that sleep time is when their brain is working and processing and assimilating all this new information that they're being bombarded with every time they're awake. And so if you translate that forward, right, now once you become a toddler and young adult and then, later in adulthood, there's not that bombarding of new information all the time, but the concept still remains that when we're asked to deal with new information, then we need a break for the brain to work and assimilate and organize that information in a way that will be useful to it. And so if you get up and you speak for hours or even 30 minutes and all you do is just, concept after new concept after new concept, the brain doesn't have time to work with that. And so really this 18-minute rule is for the benefit of your audience, but it also, if we adhere to it as a speaker, it's going to make us much, much, much more effective. Now, a couple of other interesting findings and experiments I want to tell you about just to sort of support this and drive it home. I think we've already talked enough for people to realize that this is a very important and very essential tool that is keeping the presentation short and concise. But a couple of other things I think you'll find interesting that will drive this home. A man named Roy Baumeister wrote a book called Willpower, and in that book, he talks about how our ability to exercise willpower, we actually have a very finite amount of willpower each day, according to his findings and his research. And as we use our brain and as our brains consume energy, that willpower becomes depleted, if you will. And so what he found was that what seemed like completely unrelated activities actually use the same source of energy. Things like resisting chocolate. This is the beginning of 2019, so perhaps you are on some sort of diet or lifestyle change that you're working on. And so when we first start those kinds of changes, a great amount of willpower is needed. Resisting chocolate, working on math puzzles, or listening to a presentation. Those are all, they seem to be unrelated, but they all use the same source of energy. And so I think that very quickly explains why, at the end of a really long day, we might have more trouble exercising willpower in resisting a food that we know is not good for us. I mean, think about it. Very rarely do you see a picture or a meme of someone sitting on the couch at 7 o'clock in the morning eating their favorite type of ice cream, right? It's always 11 o'clock, 11:30 at night, watching TV. They look like they're so tired they could fall asleep at any moment, and yet here they are consuming a gallon of ice or a half gallon of ice cream. So that really quickly explains that phenomenon, but it also helps to explain why listening for a long period of time can be so draining. Baumeister also talks about some experiments that were designed to measure glucose levels in people and individuals after they were doing certain tasks. So the one I found most interesting was they put two different groups of people in front of the same video clip. And in that video clip, there was, a pretty short presentation. And at the bottom, the entire time of that clip, at the bottom there was words printed. And in the one group, they just told them, you know what, just go, relax, watch the video, pay attention to whatever you want to pay attention to, and let us know how you like it. The other group, they sent in to watch the same video clip with the same words printed at the bottom, but they specifically told them, be sure that you ignore the words that will be scrolling across the bottom of the screen. And then when they measured the glucose levels in the two groups after the video clip, they found that the one that was told to ignore the words scrolling across the bottom of the screen had significantly lower glucose levels in the body than the group that was just told to relax and go in there and watch the video however you would like. Now, we haven't talked a lot about glucose, but glucose is the main source of energy for the brain, and the body takes the glucose and it transfers it or changes it into neurotransmitters, and then of course that's what the brain uses to fire and make connections and so on. So after just doing a pretty simple task, what we find is that the brain was working significantly harder in one than the other, and that depletes the glucose, which in turn depletes the energy. So if you have a long, meandering presentation, then you're forcing your listeners to work harder and to consume more energy. And the bottom line is, you don't want to make them so tired in listening to your presentation that they don't have any energy afterwards to retain that, to share that, to act on it. I mean, that's the point of making the presentation to begin with, is to elicit some sort of action. And if they're so exhausted from listening, then that's going to make that sort of hard. And I think the one sentence that Gallo uses kind of sums it up the best. 18 minutes can be stimulating. An hour or 3 hours can be mind-numbing, and especially in some of the information that we specialize in, just the technicalities of it and the sheer amount of information that can really, really do more harm than good if we can't figure out how to pare it down and make it something the audience can get a hold of and act on in a short manner. Now, I think another idea here that we need to talk about quickly, as I'm myself am now approaching my own 18-minute time limit, is that in almost all cases, you're going to need some creativity in order to get your information communicated in 18 minutes or less. And we have this misconception about creativity where, creativity is just this, there's no restraints and there's no limits, and I just allow my mind to go wherever it pleases. In actuality, creativity thrives under constraints. When you really stop and think about creativity, what is it that promotes creativity? Well, it's some sort of limitation. It's some sort of thing that we can't conquer, that we can't beat. And that's when the mind works best, because it's forced to be creative and to approach the problem from a different point of view, or from a different perspective. And you will be more successful and you will be a better presenter if you force yourself into some limitations that maybe are uncomfortable and maybe make things difficult for a while, but it will put you in a position where your brain and your mind will have to get creative. And when you have to get creative, that's when you can really bring out the best of your information, your ideas, and your own passion and desire to present the topic. Creativity thrives under intelligent constraints. The main event of the imagination, creativity, does not require unrestrained freedom. Rather, it relies on limits and obstacles. And again, you can easily see this played out just by watching children play. And the times that they get most creative are the times when they just have a few things to play with. And what do? Well, all of a sudden a block becomes a telephone, or a box becomes a ship or an airplane, or a stool that they have becomes the seat of a car. It's just amazing to watch them, but they don't get creative when they have an iPad and they can produce whatever their mind conjures up with a snap of the finger. That's not when they're creative. They're creative when they have some restraints, but yet they have this desire to play, as all children do. And so that's when you really see the best creativity. And that's what's going to happen as well when you get ready to present something. Now, are there things that can't be presented in that Goldilocks 18 to 20 minutes? Of course there are. We have weekend seminars where, the entire weekend is needed to cover some material. But the point is, if you put some constraints on yourself and you really work towards that 15 to 18, 20 minute chunk of information, you can really become creative and you can help your audience and you'll be more effective. Now, one final concept I want to share with you, I think will be a very practical way of implementing this. It's called the rule of 3. And Gallo talks about this in pretty good length, but I'm just going to kind of summarize and throw it out there as a tool to use when you're trying to pare down your presentation to a shorter time slot. The rule of 3 simply means that people can remember 3 pieces of information really well. As you add more items, the retention falls off considerably. It's one of the most powerful concepts in writing and communication. People can remember 3 things at a time, and that's basically it. Okay? I'm going to pick on my husband here for just a second. When we go out to eat at a restaurant, we either all order individually, or guess who gets to go up to the counter at a fast food restaurant and order? It's usually me. Because we've laughed about this many times. He does not like to try to remember what every kid wants to eat and what I want to eat. It's overwhelming. I mean, there's 6 of us now. I mean, he has to go up and order his own, and by that time he gets his and mine and maybe one kid, everybody else is out of luck. You're just going to get what comes out after that, right? But that's how everybody's brain works, really, is we can get 3 pieces of information and we can hold those, or we can retain that really well. After that, it's just, it's sort of a crapshoot as far as like what you're going to be able to keep and what you're going to forget. So how does that work in a presentation? Well, Gallo talks about the structure that can help us fit things into a 3. He says, step 1, create a Twitter-friendly headline. And we've talked about that in great detail, 140 characters or less. What is the main idea? That's your Twitter-friendly headline. Then step 2, support that headline with 3 key messages, and you have to pare it down. If it's impossible to pare it down to 3, then maybe you have more than one presentation here. Maybe there's, a half hour or 20 minutes of one and a break, and then there's another presentation. Begin to think creatively, because you have to get it down to something that your audience can remember and act on. Remember, that's the purpose. When we give these presentations, it's not to make ourselves feel good that we, talked about a significant amount of information in 60 minutes. That's not communication. Communication is when we get that information from us to our audience in a way that they can use it. Then we have communicated. So figure out how to support that Twitter-friendly headline with 3 key messages. And then step 3, reinforce the 3 messages with stories, statistics, and examples. And you guessed it, it's best if you have 3 under each one of those. So if you can come up with 3 stories, 3 statistics, 3 examples, or any combination of those under those 3 key messages, then you're on your way to a presentation that people can remember, and that they will remember for longer than just, the time that you're speaking, which of course, as we've talked about, is the whole point of speaking to start with. Well, that wraps up our discussion of the 18-minute rule and the rule of 3. I hope you got some practical things from our discussion today. To me, this was one of the better chapters in the book because it was so practical and helpful. Now, next week, we'll wrap up our discussion of this book with the last 2 tips or secrets of public speaking. And then, of course, we'll jump right into another book. I'm debating between 2 right now, so I don't want to tease that too much. I haven't made a final decision, but I'll let you know what that is next week when we're wrapping up this discussion.
Thank you for listening to the Tough Decisions Network. Be sure to visit toughdecisions.net to gain access to show notes for this episode and to join our free weekly entrepreneur email, where we will send you news about the latest technology for your business, inspiring quotes, and the latest books for entrepreneurs. That's toughdecisions.net. effecitve.net.